I'm Virginia Postrel. Welcome to my podcast. My guest is Sam Bowman, one of the co-founders of Works in Progress magazine and the head of Stripe Press. In this conversation, which was recorded on September 27th, we talk about how Works in Progress got started, what strikes Sam about American culture when he visits the U.S., how Britain can get its economic mojo back, and why fatherhood didn't prove as apocalyptic as Sam feared. We also discuss Sam's housing theory of everything, one of my favorites. Let's get started. Hi, Sam.
Hey, how's it going?
Good. Thanks for joining me. So we know each other through Works in Progress. I think we actually originally met on Twitter, but I thought we should start by talking a little bit about Works in Progress, how you ended up starting it, and how you, in terms of your career path, got there, and what the inspiration for starting the magazine was, you and your colleagues.
Cool. Okay, great. Well, thanks for having me on. So I started Works in Progress basically as like a hobby or side project. We began the planning in 2019, myself and my friend Saloni Tatani, plus two other friends, Ben Southwood and Nick Whitaker. And what we wanted to do, or the kind of gap we saw in the market was all of us were sort of frustrated that there was nowhere that we could do the kind of long form writing about the things that we cared about, that we wanted to. And also we knew a lot of people who, didn't have the interest in, say, setting up a Substack. I can't actually remember if Substack was even a thing back then, but, doing something like a Substack, but still had really interesting things to say. And so we thought, okay, well, we could do this as a magazine, a slightly pretentious way of talking about an online way of publishing things. Blog is the less lofty.
Well, yeah. Although Irving Kristol back in the day, in the 80s, or maybe the 70s, he used to have a saying of "got a problem, get a magazine." Every time there was a gap in the policy market in the U.S., he would.
I think there's actually a lot to that for us, because as we began to run it, we got an Emergent Ventures grant from Tyler Cowen and the Mercatus Center to set it up, and we used that to pay for the website to be built and to pay our authors. And as we started to do it, it became more popular, I think, than we expected, and we began to realize that a lot of the policy type thinking and work that we had been, or some of us had been doing at think tanks. I worked at the Adam Smith Institute for a lot of the 2010s, along with Ben, my co-founder. We kind of realized that, yes, there's a big role for think tank white papers and think tank research and stuff like that, but there was a bit of a gap between, reactive writing an 800-word article about whatever's happened in Capitol Hill that week and the think tank white paper that was this sort of longer read, but still hopefully kind of accessible to kind of non-expert people. And so I think hopefully a lot of the work we've done since setting up Works in Progress has been about, building out the sort of research that might have historically been done by a think tank in order to inform both policy debates, but also how more widely people think about things. So to give you an example, I'm a really big believer, as you know. In fact, I remember the first time we met Virginia was in London, because I was working on this idea called street votes. And this is the idea that, you buy in existing residents to upzoning, and you give them a reason to want upzoning. And I still believe that's a great idea. And we've done a lot of articles on cities that have actually done it, like Tel Aviv. We're doing an article on Seoul in South Korea. And I think that in kind of showing people that this actually happens through the medium of journalism, you can change people's opinions about, what is possible in our own policy spaces.
Right. One of the interesting things is it's a London-based magazine, but it has an international flavor, and it's definitely does stuff that's UK specific, and I want to talk in a little bit about something you did recently on that subject, but also things that are US specific, or how do you negotiate that transatlantic or global perspective?
With some difficulty. I think in our best world scenario, we're a bit like The Economist, which has a similar kind of model. It's based in London. Most economist journalists, I would guess, are from the UK, or at least based in the UK, or have some roots in the UK. But it's a very global publication, and it's a very it's there is a section on Britain in The Economist, but it's not about that. The magazine is not about the UK, and I think that's a good version. Another analogy I like to use is that we're a bit like Nintendo. Nintendo is a very clearly Japanese company, and it draws on Japanese developer talent much more than Microsoft does, or lots of Western developers do. But its main market is the United States. If it wasn't producing things that were relevant and interesting and exciting for people in the US, it wouldn't be the company that it is. And so, I think that that's true for us. I do think that British writers often have, they translate quite well into America, because we understand, like, America's obviously so important. Like, we understand America, I think, probably a little bit more than most Americans need to understand the UK. Like, the UK is not as important relative to America as America is relative to the UK. But my big fear, and something that I'm always, we are all collectively as a team always very alert to and trying to be vigilant to, is becoming too UK focused, writing things just because it's easy, because it's close to us and familiar to us. And, we very much intend to keep staff in the US, and, most of our authors are not from the UK. And so it's, that kind of model, I think, when it works well, it works really well. But there's always the danger of becoming irrelevant and parochial and just focusing on stuff because it's close to hand to you.
Right. I'm interested in your perspective, what you see when you come to the US. I mean, it doesn't have to be policy oriented. You wrote something recently on Twitter. You put something about how the UK has the best supermarkets, and I said, well, you should go to these and these, but they're not in necessarily parts of the US that you would visit. But I'm just curious, what strikes you when you come to the US?
Well, I do, I have to say, love America, and although I love America's big cities, I really, really like visiting parts of America that that often you would not visit if you were, like Alabama, rural Oregon. I make a point of, Texas Hill Country I went to a few years ago. I make a point of trying to visit parts of America that are not just New York City and Washington and San Francisco.
Right.
It's a great place. The thing that I notice most of all about Americans relative to Irish people, I'm from Ireland originally,
right,
and English people, is that I think Americans are a lot less self-conscious in terms of how they're perceived by others. That makes them a lot more outgoing, and it makes them kind of more visibly eccentric in a way that I like a lot. And Americans are super high variance. Americans are kind of always, and they celebrate, the lazy thing, I think, would be to say, well, they celebrate being the best as in being number one. I think they celebrate extremes, and I don't mean that in a kind of political way. I think Americans, like, are really interested in, like, what's the biggest thing of its category, and I would like to see that. Like, what's the biggest tree in the state? And I think that's partly a cultural thing, and partly that maybe I'm backwards. Maybe I'm reading into American culture what I see in its industries and stuff like that, and sports. But I think this real kind of collective idea that it's actually, like, it's really interesting what the biggest egg in Utah is, or like it's really, really cool that this barbecue place has, definitely the longest cooked brisket, and we're really proud of that. And people who like brisket are very interested in in ranking the list of the best. I think that kind of to me, that's very, very clear. And also, just, I mean, we'll talk about economics later, but America is also a very abundant country, and it's it certainly has its faults, but it's very clearly a very rich country. And I think something that British people especially would do well to do is to actually spend some time outside of cities, where they see houses as being quite small in New York City, although actually New York City homes are on average a lot larger than London homes. I always make a point of taking photographs and tweeting them of just like typical American houses to just sort of show people, look, they actually have a lot of stuff over here. Money can buy goods and services. Being richer in America isn't just spent on healthcare, as a lot of people think. It's spent on big cars and big houses and abundance. And I think that's a very, very nice thing to be around. It's somewhat sad that the UK, for example, doesn't have that in quite the same degree. But yeah, I do feel this sort of abundance and plenty is something that really strikes me when I'm in the US.
And yet Americans right now feel like, I mean, not everybody, but they feel like, constrained and pessimistic, and the abundance agenda has a big place here to serve a lot of frustration potentially.
Well, even then, there are a lot of ideas in the rest of the developed world that have no real purchase in America. So, degrowth is not really an idea that exists outside of the internet in America, whereas it's actually quite popular here. And, I occasionally find myself speaking to groups of, for example, university students, and it's important to deal with that and to address that and kind of take that position seriously, because a lot of people seriously hold that position in the UK. And I don't think you get that quite as much in the US. So, even on elements of the political spectrum where, you in the rest of the world may have a skepticism about kind of growth and plenty and abundance. And certainly in America, you have disagreements about how to get it. You have much less of that sense of like, is it actually worth being rich? Is it actually worth growing?
Yeah. And it's interesting to think about that, because I think the fact that the Democratic coalition, or the left of center coalition, politically includes a lot of people who have a big stake in upward mobility. Their parents were immigrants, or they were immigrants. Black Americans obviously are a huge part of the Democratic coalition, and because of the history of racial oppression in this country, a lot of them are only within my lifetime. Well, it's like, I mean, I was born, it says on my birth certificate that I'm white. I was born in this Jim Crow South, actually. They've only had a serious chance for upward mobility in the last 50 years, say. I think that, nobody's going to be telling, Kamala Harris that upward mobility is a bad thing.
Well, I think that's a very important point, and also goes into, I'm going to talk about the left here, but I don't want to do so in a way that villainizes anybody.
Right.
But I think American leftism tends to be, except for some small elements, tends to be a lot less sort of anti-market and much more about sort of who gets what share of, it's more about, certain groups feel that they're not getting their correct share. They want a larger share of the spoils of the market, or a bigger seat at the table. Whereas obviously leftism in Europe, especially, and in parts of the rest of the world that I know less well, so I'm not going to talk about them, is a lot more like fundamentally skeptical of the market, of markets as a thing, and as I say, of growth as a thing. And it's kind of interesting because American leftism, what people sometimes refer to as kind of the woke type thing, that is becoming more and more popular in the rest of the world. And now you're getting a clash between the kind of traditional sort of, maybe kind of, you call it Marxist or sort of anti-market leftism, against the sort of more American leftism that's not anti-corporate necessarily. It's sort of it sees things along very different lines, and it sees the problem not as being really a class problem, but as being a kind of race and possibly gender and maybe sexuality problem.
Right. Yeah, that's an interesting point. Well, one of your famous articles is the housing theory of everything, which I love because I sort of share it, obviously. But can you give us the basic, first of all, the inspiration of that article, which I know you did with a couple of other people, including Ben, and sort of what the argument is?
Yeah, so I found, and we found, that again and again and again, we were having conversations about some issue, let's say crime or prisons or maybe or welfare, or poverty or innovation or growth. And again and again and again, we kind of kept coming back to housing shortages as, a really important root factor. So we would talk about it would be great to have more high-skilled immigration to London, London's or to Cambridge. These are centers of science and technology. We are very, very open culturally. We are generally very, very kind of pro in the UK, having like really high-skilled people from around the world with brilliant ideas and scientists come. But we have this problem that we have incredibly poor housing shortages, especially in Cambridge, which is a city of 120,000 people that should be probably a city of 10 million people or 5 million people, but also to some extent in London. And we were observing that again and again, we just kept coming back to these problems. Even something like climate change, which is obviously not primarily driven by that, we kind of observed that dense cities where people drove around less, and were more able to either walk or bicycle or rely on public transport, were much, much less carbon emitting than suburban areas or than countryside areas on a per capita basis, on a per person basis. So we did a lot of reading. It took us a long time actually to come to the article that we eventually wrote called "The Housing Theory of Everything," which makes this argument that housing shortages are, if not the cause, they are a major cause or a contributing cause of most of the problems that affect Western developed countries. And so, we usually think of housing shortages as being a problem because they mean housing costs more money. And that's obviously true. And most people experience housing shortages through having to pay higher rents or having to borrow more money to get a mortgage. And in doing so, being kind of more exposed to things like changes in interest rates if you have a variable rate mortgage, in which most people outside the US do. What we argue is that that's only really skimming the surface, and a much more important effect of high housing costs is it's actually housing scarcity that's the problem. The high housing cost is a sign that housing is scarce, but it isn't actually the proximate issue. The real problem is that there aren't enough houses in places that people want to be, and the consequences of that are people can't move to higher wage areas, they can't get better jobs themselves, so their own kind of individual productivity is reduced, they can't combine with each other, they can't, sometimes in a company, sometimes doing deals across companies, but I think very often totally socially and kind of informally over a beer or over lunch, where you just have an idea and you realize, oh, your knowledge of biology and my knowledge of AI, like we could actually do something really important here. And I had never thought about that until I kind of met you for this beer, in a chance encounter in a pub. And we found that there's a lot of empirical evidence for these sorts of propositions, that, it's very, very clear that there are very large aggregate costs to the United States from housing shortages, especially in places like New York and the San Francisco Bay Area. It's pretty clear that innovation is slowed down by people not being able to move to places like that. But then we also kind of broadened out from economics into, as I mentioned, climate change, but also discovered things like obesity, which is clearly related to some extent to how much people eat, but it's also related to how much people walk and how kind of car reliant they are. And I'm by no means anti-car, but I definitely want people to be able to live in less car reliant ways if they would like to live in less car reliant ways. And observed that a lot of the effect in Japan, which is kind of famously one of the least obese developed countries in the world, yes, of course, it's partly driven by diet, it's partly driven by lifestyle factors that have nothing to do with housing, but it's also driven by the fact that Japanese people walk an awful lot, and so on. And the kind of final point that that is now very kind of close to my heart, because I have just had a baby with my partner earlier this year, is that housing shortages, and particularly space shortages, seem to be a big constraint on people's ability to have children when they want to have the children, and sort of over their lives on how many
Right.
children they end up having. And I think there's a lot more research to be done there, because that is the area where I think the intuition is strong, where I think there's quite a lot of kind of observational and anecdotal evidence, but there's still, I think, the actual, would I have a gun put to my head and say, I can prove that this effect is true based on the existing empirical literature? No, I think the empirical literature has a lot more to do. But that's exciting, because it kind of tells me that we're on a frontier, and we might be able to discover new things.
Yeah. I mean, this was kind of a data point in support of that. I live in a 3-bedroom condo that was built in 1974. And when it was built, it was cheap housing that was an alternative to single family homes. Nowadays, I don't know if anybody builds 3-bedroom condos or apartments in Los Angeles. They're lucky if they build 2 bedrooms. Well, the result is that the condos in our building, which has only got 14 units, are extremely desirable for families. And because it's big enough where, you can raise kids in a 3-bedroom house, basically. And so it's good for me. I mean, I always argue against my personal interest that we should allow more, more building, more stuff. but one result is that these condos, which were not designed to be super nice housing, have become increasingly valuable, because people the last couple that have sold, or 2 out of the last 3 have sold to families with, multiple children or children on the way. But,
I think there's a lot to learn from the perspective of actual developing of houses, building houses from apartments that are family friendly. It's a big concern that I have that, well, it's not a concern. It's a thing that we need to get better at, is building apartments that people are happy to bring up children in, because there aren't really that many in London, for example. I moved into a house when we had our son, because there just weren't really apartments that were suitable to raise a family in. And I think there are some memes, or there are some people who think that there's something inherent about apartments that means, because you don't have garden access, or because it's awkward to bring a push chair up and down an elevator or whatever. And they may be right, but I hope they're not right. And I think there are enough examples historically of people raising families, affluent people raising families in apartments, but we're just not really building them. And on the Japanese point, a lot of people, I think, have correctly pointed out that Japan has sort of the closest thing to housing abundance that any developed country has. And it also has an incredibly low birth rate. So that's a pretty strong argument against my position.
Well, I think the housing problem, is solving that housing for families problem may be necessary, but it's not sufficient.
Agreed. But I do think one point in response to the Japanese point, because I've been thinking about it recently, is Japanese dwellings are abundant, but Japanese actual dwelling sizes are very small.
Yes, they are.
And especially in Tokyo, which is where all the jobs are, and especially if you haven't inherited a property, or you're earlier on in your life cycle. So one area where I think there's a lot of interesting research to do is to try to correct for the fact that we usually just count the number of dwellings to determine housing supply.
Yeah,
when
you
actually
need to
what
count
people care about is size.
Right. We would say square feet per person, which is much larger, I'm sure, in the US than any place else.
and it's there are all sorts of other factors like that, and to be clear, it's obvious if you look at the total fertility rates in Korea, Japan. I mean, there's clearly not. It's not that they have suddenly had a problem with the size of their homes or anything like that. Right. But as you say, it's all of these things have many causes, and thus they have many solutions, none of which will be singular, but might kind of improve things and change the direction for people.
Well, speaking of your son, you tweeted something to the effect of, people exaggerate how hard it is to have kids, or how, I wondered if you would elaborate on that. I know it's just a tweet. It wasn't a carefully considered essay.
It's so yes. So I was really surprised when our son was born by how much less apocalyptic it was compared to what I expected. I honestly sort of held off quite late in my life. I'm 36. Finn is our first child, hopefully not our last. To some extent, because I felt that once I had a child, that would kind of be the end of my life, and the end of my social life. The end of my ability to do things for myself. And I sort of thought that once you have kids, that's it. Like the line in Lost in Translation when Bill Murray says, your life is over, but they're wonderful. And that's and that's just, I mean, I think that the problem with that is that when you don't have kids, it's wonderful bit is sort of meaningless. It's like somebody telling you about a sense that you don't have, or it's like having, oh, it's really great, you should go to Bhutan, it's a really, really cool place. Like, okay, great, but I haven't been there, and I'm probably not going to go there. Or like, this is an experience that I'm not that, it doesn't mean anything to me to tell me this. And so you end up presenting people with a very asymmetric view of the costs and benefits, where you say, oh, it's really terrible, it's really awful, but there's this magical thing that makes it all worthwhile. And if you don't have the magical thing, that doesn't mean anything to you. So I think that it is actually quite harmful for us to talk so much about how difficult it is to have kids. And I think that it's pretty understandable why we do that, because it allows us to share our frustration. It allows us to have a bit of solidarity for people who are having. Some parents do have a much harder time than we did, and I respect that, and I'm certainly and I do I do really not want to sound like a horrible person or dick or anything. It's definitely the case that some people do have genuinely a really tough time. But I think it's also important to acknowledge that not everybody does, and that in fact the average is probably a lot less bad than most people think, because there is this slight sense that you're kind of a dick, you're kind of boasting if you say, well, my baby slept through the night. Incidentally, my baby does not sleep through the night at the moment, and I was awake at 5:30 this morning, and I do not want to pretend that this is not a tiring thing, and it's and I didn't go to a football match that I would have gone to last night because because I wanted to be home, and I didn't want to be leaving my partner to do all the work. So I do not want to suggest that it's costless, but it's also not for a lot of people the kind of end of the world that I think we are, that the kind of cultural norm is at the moment to say it is.
It's interesting. Although I'd like to hear from your partner too.
she
well, first of all, what does she do for a living?
She's on parental leave still. So but yeah. So,
I mean, I always say it's like, it's different for women. First of all, because the way careers nest with the biological clock, I could conceivably have had kids, in my 40s in terms of my career. But if I'd had kids in my 30s, you would not be talking to me now.
Yeah. And I recognize that, and I'm certainly not saying, oh, women shouldn't complain about this. But I, speaking on behalf of, speaking as a father, and speaking as a reasonably, I mean, I'm certainly not the world's best. I'm not saying I'm in the top 10% of putting effort in. I try, but
yeah.
but I do think that to other men who are in their late 20s or their 30s or their 40s even, who are kind of thinking, do I want to give up the things that I have in order to have a child, and feel like, wow, that sounds really terrible. I want to say, it is probably less bad than you think.
Yeah.
And yes, it's very nice in ways that you probably can't, don't care about right now.
Right.
But it's also not as bad as you think it might be.
Yeah.
That's really the only thing. And I do think that I don't want to speak for my partner. And I'm not going,
I don't want you to either.
I'm not going to. But
I doubt she regrets having a kid, though. I'm sure she's happy.
Well, no, but it's more that I think that women that I have spoken to, many also feel that the balance isn't quite right in terms of how we talk about the difficulty of having children and raising children, and feel that it's different for them, but many people have both men and women have said to me that they agree that where the kind of cultural balance is right now in terms of talking about the difficulties of parenting isn't quite accurate, and does actually put people off over time. And the problem with children is that putting things off by a year or two is actually quite costly in terms of your total ability to have kids. It's not just a timing thing. It's an aggregate output thing as well. So I think it matters.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, I think that makes sense. It used to be it was only very weird, unusual people like me who made decisions not to have kids, and it was definitely seen as a sacrifice. Now it's seen as like a sacrifice to have kids, which is kind of weird. But anyway, so I want to get to your most recent magnum opus, which is on why Britain has stagnated. Because, and I just want to pull one of the you have bullet points at the beginning, and one of them I just found really persuasive. The planning documentation for the Lower Thames crossing, a proposed tunnel under the Thames connecting Kent and Essex, runs to 360,000 pages, and the application process alone has cost £297 million. That is more than twice as much as it cost Norway to actually build the largest road in the world.
The largest road tunnel.
Road tunnel. I'm sorry. Yeah, right. The largest road tunnel in the world. And this is just one little thing that you have at the beginning. What is the basic argument of this?
The core argument is that the UK has stopped growing because it doesn't allow things to get built, and that the things that it does allow to get built are unnecessarily expensive. So partly we're arguing that, and the things that I'm talking about specifically are housing. They are kind of business premises, including stuff like research labs and data centers. They are transit infrastructure, including roads and including things like railways and tramways. And they are energy infrastructure, energy supply, specifically nuclear power. And one of the points that we make in the piece specifically about energy is that intermittent renewables like wind and solar seem very, very, very unsuited to the UK. And while they may have some, solar in particular may have a lot of upside in the United States, in Spain, in North Africa, in other sunny parts of the world, it is not viable in the UK in anything except, putting some solar panels on your roof to power your air conditioning. And yet we subsidize it enormously in ways that are very, very hard to see. And so the overall argument is that the consequence of this has been people are not able to move to cities, as I talked about earlier,
right.
that people in existing built up areas aren't able to travel to better jobs. So you actually have parts of the UK where you have lots of towns that emerged during the Industrial Revolution because they were near coal, or they were near, a river because there was a mill there or something like that, that are not very far away as the crow flies from relatively prosperous cities like Manchester or Birmingham, but in terms of actual travel time are incredibly long. They're like hours, and they have loads of road congestion. So it's like you're in a different city.
Right.
And so the kind of same effects that you get when people move into cities, you can get by just allowing them to move on a day-to-day basis by commuting into cities, and they don't get those. And that
keeps those areas poorer than they need to be, because the people in them can neither move to the more prosperous city because of the housing problem, nor commute to it because of the transit problem.
Exactly. And what our argument is with infrastructure in particular is less. So, some people have interpreted what we're writing about just as what we call planning, where it's like permitting and zoning in roughly the same system. That's a big part of the problem. But our argument with infrastructure is that we have moved quite recently, only in the last 30 years, to a system where central government pays for most major infrastructure projects. And what that means is that there is no real skin in the game, and there's no entity that can go bankrupt or will be voted out on the basis of overspend. So there is effectively no real reason. Nobody is really keeping control of costs, except for the Treasury, which is the UK Finance Department, which doesn't really pay attention on a sort of item by item basis. It pays attention on a total bill basis. So they do often just cancel projects or just say, no, this project is going to be too expensive. You're not allowed to do it. There is nobody who has an incentive to do the project and do it really cheaply. Whereas historically, we used to build kind of everything in the incentive aligned way. Basically all railways in the UK, not literally all, but almost all of the railways in the UK were built privately. They were built by private companies that used a combination of land value capture. They would build a train line out to a field and build some houses around the station, and then sell the houses and charge people to use the train line. And that was their business model. And most of the railways into London, for example, were built that way. We don't really do that anymore at all. The private railway construction is a thing of the past. Local government built a lot of the tramways that used to be kind of integral to almost all English cities. The city that had the first tramway now doesn't have any trams. It's the largest city in Europe that doesn't have any trams. It's Leeds. Doesn't have any mass transit system other than buses.
Just for us foreigners, when you say trams, you mean what is called
streetcar, I think you'd call them in America.
Well, they're called streetcars or trolleys, or in the infrastructure world, light rail. So
yeah.
But here's the thing. Trams, I mean, you take them for granted as good, but I question them because they just take up more of the street and they clog up traffic, unless I'm not understanding. Maybe they work differently. But I mean, if you compare, like in Boston, there's something called the Green Line, which is mostly a tram system, versus other lines which are mostly underground. And it's kind of it's much slower. I don't know. I'm not sure it's superior to a bus.
That's a long running debate that transit people have been having, and for a long time, I think. My view is that trams work in certain contexts where they allow much higher capacity for a kind of given a given car. You can get people on much more quickly, and you can get people off much more quickly because they have many more doors. As a unit, you can get people on and off faster than with a bus. And maybe it would be possible to design buses that do that, but I don't think I've never seen one that does that. But I think possibly more importantly, they also offer a commitment mechanism that a route will be serviced in a particular way. So unlike a bus, I think buses are huge victims to political economy problems. Like, buses run in very, very, very inefficient ways because bus routes are often done according to the slowest people, the kind of people who are most politically powerful, or at least most politically vocal. And I think we should run buses for elderly people, but I think in London, for example, we have way too many stops along most bus routes because they are the most vocal people, and you can't remove bus stops because people will scream bloody murder about them. And the routes that they go are incredibly inefficient and slow. But I'm open to I'm not going to go to the wall over trams.
Yeah, I didn't want to. I just had to make that little.
Well, I think I think it's a reasonable point. But I think that where they work well in Europe, they're more like light rail than they are like buses. They have dedicated.
It's
not that they're sharing space it's not that they're sharing roads with cars, and they get their own route, and so it's like a cheap version of doing light rail rather than an expensive way of doing buses.
Right. That's a good way to put it. So who is the audience for this? This is, I should say to people who are listening or watching, this article is very long and covers a lot of territory, and it makes a very convincing argument. There's lots of graphs, and one of the things you do, actually I should ask you about this, is you compare Britain to France, and I'm sure a lot of people in Britain would think, especially people who are more market oriented, would think, well, France is a horrible place. They got labor issues. They got, you can't fire anybody. You get people riot. And if every time anybody proposes any change, people go on strike all the time. And yet you argue France is, the data say France is more productive than Britain. How is that possible?
Exactly. I actually, we do cite productivity statistics. I don't put a huge amount in
and I should
productivity.
Specify you talk about labor productivity as opposed to, for example, total factor productivity or capital productivity, which are
correct. Yeah. And France and Germany have higher unemployment rates than the UK, so they've sort of lopped off the least productive people from working. They also have longer holidays and earlier retirement ages. So France and Germany, I think, are more productive by most standards, but I think that the numbers flatter them quite a bit because they're like banning people from doing the kind of less productive work.
I was wondering about labor force participation rates because it sounds like you can be very productive if you only allow the most productive people to work and you put everybody else on the dole, and then it.
But however, the mystery is it doesn't actually matter for our point if France is more productive than the UK, because the mystery is that how is it that a country that, as you say, has institutionalized rioting anytime the government tries to lower raise the pension age, it has
to 64, which is 64. My age.
We have an estimate of the tax wedge of how much for a worker to bring home 61,000 euros. How much does the employer have to pay in Britain versus France? So in Britain, the employer would have to pay 97,000 euros for the worker to bring home 61,000. In France, for a worker to bring home 61,000 euro, the employer would have to pay 137,000 euros. So 40,000 euros more than the employer in Britain for the same take-home pay. And this is an incredibly highly taxed country and very, very highly regulated, as you say. And yet it is roughly as rich as the UK. So how is it that, it's either that we're wrong and high taxes do not actually have economic effects that are bad, and actually it's kind of a free lunch to tax high earners and things like that, and regulations are really not a big deal at all, and strikes are really not a big deal at all, or it's that France is getting something right that we're getting wrong. And our argument is that the things that France gets right are it builds and has built historically. Most importantly, it has built historically things much more easily than the UK has. So, Paris has tripled in footprint. Paris has sprawled where London has basically stayed the same size since 1945.
And London has not built up. I mean, it has built up, but not as much as, the idea of people who hate sprawl is like, well, don't sprawl, build up. But London hasn't done that either, at least in terms of housing.
No. No, I mean, London's population is basically the same as what it was in 1939. It dipped a lot after the Second World War as people went to the suburbs, and they've come back. But, London basically has not grown since 1939. And incidentally, French sprawl is horrible. Like French urban sprawl is incredibly ugly. France is a very dense city at its core, and Paris is a very dense city at its core. But French urban sprawl is everybody who hates sprawl it should be your nightmare. It's a lot worse than a lot of American sprawl. It's very ugly. But the French have built far more miles of motorway, far more metro systems, far more tramways. Maybe that's a bad thing. Maybe it's a good thing. Far more high-speed rail, far more, they have done these things much more cheaply. And crucially, one of the points of comparison we keep making in the piece is about energy. France, after the 1970s oil crisis, the French government made a strategic decision that they did not want France to be exposed to that kind of risk again. And they did a huge state-driven build of nuclear power plants. I'm sure, incidentally, that they could have done that a lot more efficiently. I am by no means a fan of the state building lots of nuclear power stations, but I am a fan of building nuclear power stations, and they kind of accidentally decarbonized about 30 years before everybody else. France generates far more electricity from nuclear than any other country in the world, and the consequence has been that energy costs in France are much lower than they are in the UK. And for businesses, French companies pay about 30% less for electricity, and big French companies pay nearly 50% less for electricity compared to English ones. Now, American energy costs are even lower again. So it's not like France is beating America. But when it comes to energy prices are just much higher in Europe generally, and France is a reasonably good kind of foil. And our argument is that it's not a coincidence that France is rich, having done all this stuff. This is why this is what gives France the productivity and the economic potential that then it decides to spend on early retirement ages and long holidays in the summer and high taxes and a big welfare state. And I personally would make a different decision. I would prefer the kind of more Anglo-Saxon model of a relatively smaller state and a relatively more open economy, a much more open economy, in fact. But those are legitimate decisions that can be had. And the audience for this, the general audience is everybody in the UK. The specific audiences are, I think, two groups. One is the center right. We wrote it in we were, I think, maybe a little bit more open about our personal political preferences than we normally would be in a piece of policy writing, because normally you want a piece of policy writing to not just appeal to one constituency of people. But I think after the election, when the Tories were nearly wiped out, like the Conservative Party was nearly destroyed, and deservedly so, because they presided over a very, very, very bad 14 years, as we argue in the piece. And I think that they need to start from they need a new set of principles to think about what they are trying to do with the country. And the comparisons we draw, we talk about the Thatcher revolution, which we argue was indeed very, very good for the UK. And I think we've got some pretty good data that makes that case. And also we talk about the much less well-known period in the 1930s, where the UK actually inherited a lot of similar problems to the ones it has now that were hangovers from the First World War. So, things like high inflation, rent controls, big constraints on, things that could be built and stuff like that. It liberalized very rapidly, and it had this huge boom in not just house building, but also in infrastructure being built mostly privately, in the national grid, the world's first, I think, national grid, electricity grid was built. And the result was that the UK had this kind of mini economic boom in the 1930s, while the rest of the world, yeah, right, exactly. While the US was experiencing the worst depression in world history, while Germany was becoming a literal, a figurative nightmare. It was becoming like France was on its knees. And the effect of this, and this is the point that we're kind of making to people who are maybe less interested in economics, was that Britain was able to rearm in this time. Britain bought itself time to pick itself up and was able to then be in a position to fight Nazi Germany and to win ultimately. And our argument is that, for all of the other things that people care about, you need growth as the underlying, you must have growth. And all of the other reforms that people want to make, they're very important. We're not saying that these things are the only thing that matter, but we're saying that they provide the foundations, which is why we've used this term, for all of the other reforms that you might want to do. And so really the main audience is people on the centre right in the UK who have gone through a very, very, I think, unimpressive and destructive period in government, and now have to ask themselves, how do we actually think about what's good for the country and what are we doing, what can we offer that's good for the country. And I hope this might be it. But I also hope that people on the left pick this up. I've been very encouraged by people who are not aligned and how much they've liked the piece. And there's just a big appetite in the UK for something that says, like, this is the problem, and now we have to figure out how to solve it.
Yeah. Well, that's a great, and I'll put a link to it in the show notes, and people can, and I'll once I figure out how to do this, I'll try to add some of your graphs to the podcast as well, to the video. We're coming up on the end of the hour. I always like to end by asking people for recommendations for reading, aside from works in progress, of course. What would you recommend people read? And this could be, this could be a novel you like that has nothing to do with anything we've talked about, or it could be things online, whatever.
The highbrow suggestion I'll make is a translation of the Canterbury Tales that I've been reading. I've never read the Canterbury Tales. I didn't even really know what it was until quite recently. And I got a modern translation because it's written in kind of Middle English. It's very difficult to, you've probably read it actually, but I had never, I've never read it.
My degree is in English literature, and I was required to basically take a Chaucer course, which, to be honest, I didn't particularly care for, but that was more to do with the professor than the writing.
This might be worth taking a look at if you have any desire to revisit that course, because it's written in it. It's still set in the time. It's still true to the original text, but you can actually read it, and you can actually interpret it as a modern reader. And I found it, it's not really that interesting as literature. Like, some of the stories are really boring, and some of the stories are like ridiculously sexually explicit in a just bizarre way. Yeah. But it's interesting because it's it feels to me like a real, I've never had such a good understanding of that period of history, 14th century England. And like, this is the sort of thing that they would have found interesting at that time, and that like would have seemed like a thing that you would say to each other at that time. And from that kind of historical perspective, it's really, really good.
Yeah.
And my kind of slightly lower brow is the Master and Commander novels, which are just set on a ship in the Napoleonic Wars, and they're just very immersive, and I like them a lot. But those are not going to win me any kind of highbrow points. So yeah.
All right, thanks a lot, Sam, and I look forward to seeing you in a few weeks in San Francisco or Berkeley, wherever. And I appreciate you coming on my podcast to be one of my initial guinea pigs. At some point, it will become a real thing.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Okay, now I have to find my cursor. Thanks for joining me for this conversation with Sam Bowman. Please check out the show notes for information on some of the things we talked about. My next podcast guest will be political scientist Steve Tellis of Johns Hopkins University and the Niskanen Center. This will be a special 2-episode conversation. In the first, we'll talk about the abundance movement and what its political strategy should be. In the second, we'll talk about the problem of academic sectarianism and why and how university departments should recruit grad students and professors with a broader range of political views. To read my work and hear more podcasts, please subscribe to my newsletter at vpostrel.substack.com. Check out my YouTube channel at vpostrel, which includes a podcast playlist. You can subscribe to Virginia's podcast on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get podcasts. Thanks for listening. See you next time.